Joyce Flynn from the CBS sitcom Mike and Molly, the wine mom, the loose cannon, the one you could always count on to say exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment and somehow turn it into the funniest line of the episode. Loved her for years, genuinely, and honestly, I still do. But something shifted for me a while back and I cannot put it back together, which means I need you to see it too, because Joyce Flynn is not a comic relief character who occasionally has feelings underneath the jokes. She is a woman who lost her husband when her daughters were still children, who never processed a single day of that grief, and who spent 6 seasons performing happiness so loudly that nobody stopped to ask if she was okay. Not the other characters, not the writers, and definitely not us. By the end of this, you are going to watch every Joyce scene differently. Every joke, every glass of wine, every time she says something that cuts a little too deep and the audience laughs anyway. You are going to see what was sitting right there the whole time. The concept I want you to hold on to through all of this is called complicated grief, also formally recognized as prolonged grief disorder in the DSM-5-TR in 2022, and it describes what happens when a person experiences a major loss and then, instead of moving through it, constructs an entire personality around avoiding it. The drinking, the performance, the relentless insistence on youthfulness, the sharp edges pointed outward at everyone who gets close enough to matter. None of that is character. All of that is armor. And the cruelest thing about complicated grief is how convincing it looks from the outside, because it looks like someone who has moved on, someone who remarried and raised 2 daughters and throws dinner parties and flirts and makes everyone in the room laugh. It looks like a woman who is fine. It looks like Joyce Flynn. So let me walk you through it. The first time you met Joyce, she already had a drink in her hand and was already too much, already too loud, too sharp, too close to some edge you could not quite name. The show dropped you into the middle of her life and asked you to find it funny, and you did, and so did I, and so did everyone watching. But here is what those early episodes never told you. Joyce had been managing alone for years before the cameras arrived because her husband passed when Molly was a child, somewhere around 8 or 10 years old, and from that point forward, Joyce raised both daughters by herself. No partner, no safety net, just a house and 2 kids, and whatever she could hold together on any given day, in a city like Chicago where keeping a household running alone is no small thing. The show gives you the result without the origin, the wine before the reason for it, and that is not carelessness on the writer's part. That is the show keeping the tragedy at a careful distance, so the comedy stays intact. The tragedy was always there though, right underneath every single episode. Here is the thing most people walked right past. In Season 4, Episode 12, Molly goes to a therapist and the whole situation gets played for laughs because of course it does. But what the therapist actually tells her is that her instability, her erratic behavior, the way she has always struggled to hold her own life together, traces back to a single event, her father passing. That loss destabilized the entire household, and Molly has been carrying the weight of that destabilization ever since, well into her 30s. Now, the show frames this as Molly's story, her revelation, her breakthrough, but pay attention to what it actually describes. The therapist is mapping the aftermath of Joyce's loss, because Molly did not raise herself. Joyce did that. And if Molly, who was a child when her father passed, is still in a therapist's office decades later trying to untangle the damage, what does that tell you about Joyce, who was the adult in that household, who had no therapist, who had no one? Think about that for a second. And here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. In Season 4, Episode 19, Joyce calls Molly irresponsible, not gently and not with much softening, and holds the house over her as evidence. The house Joyce managed to keep after her husband passed, the one asset she held onto through the grief and the years of single parenthood and everything else that came with it. The show reads this moment as classic difficult Joyce, another example of her being too much, but that house is not just a house, it is the physical proof that she survived, the thing she kept standing when everything else was falling, and she weaponizes it because she never learned how to give love without attaching fear to it. Fear was the only tool she had when she was doing it alone, and here it is, 30 years later, still running, still pointing outward, still landing on the people closest to her, every single time. Season 5, Episode 10, brings the driving under the influence checkpoint, and Mike arrests Joyce, his own mother-in-law, puts her in handcuffs, and gets her license suspended for 12 months. The audience laughed, naturally, because Joyce in handcuffs is objectively absurd on the surface, and honestly, when I first watched it, I laughed too. But when I figured out what this scene actually was, it genuinely made me sad, because this is not a quirky wine mom moment that got slightly out of hand. This is the moment the show acknowledges, right out loud, that Joyce's relationship with the bottle is not a running gag with no consequences. What we are watching, clinically, is functional alcoholism, the ability to hold a life together on the surface while the dependency runs underneath, invisible until a moment like this one makes it impossible to look away. It has legal consequences. Her family is embarrassed. Her son-in-law is the one who has to take her in. And then the show resets, because next episode she is back with a glass in her hand and a perfectly timed sharp line, and nobody says a word about any of it, because the comedy format cannot hold what the truth of Joyce's drinking actually weighs. So it buries it back under the laugh track, and we let it go right along with it. What kept pulling me back, especially after the therapy episode, is the way prolonged grief does not just damage the person carrying it. It radiates outward, and there is a well-documented psychological pattern called parentification, where a child steps into an emotional anchoring role for a struggling parent, a stabilizing function they were never supposed to fill. Attachment theory helps explain why this happens. When a primary caregiver is emotionally unavailable, even with the best intentions, children reorganize their own attachment behavior to compensate, becoming the stable presence the parent needs rather than the other way around. You can see this pattern running through the whole dynamic between Joyce and Molly. Molly is the responsible one, the anxious one, the one who reads situations and manages them, who worries in the way that people worry when they learned early that nobody else was going to. She is the daughter who carried something she should never have had to carry, and she carried it for decades before a therapist in a season 4 sitcom episode even gave it a name. Joyce loved her completely and genuinely. There is no question about that. But love without boundaries is still a weight, and Molly bent under it for 30 years while Joyce kept performing and pouring and pointing those sharp edges somewhere else. Remember when Joyce married Vince? Season 3, Episode 7, after more than a year of an engagement that had gone nowhere, Joyce reached a breaking point and started flirting with his brother, and the confrontation that followed brought out the real reason for the delay. Vince was broke. They got married at a courthouse the same day, and we were supposed to feel happy for her, and in the moment, I did feel happy for her. Look at the shape of it, though. Joyce did not build slowly and carefully toward a second marriage. She detonated toward one, because the instant she felt Vince creating any distance, even slightly, even passively, something in her cracked wide open. That is not a romantic temperament. That is abandonment terror, the specific kind that lives in a person whose first marriage ended not by choice but by loss, suddenly and without preparation, leaving her no chance to brace for it. Attachment theory has a name for this too: anxious attachment, the pattern where any perceived threat of separation triggers a disproportionate response because the original loss was so total and so uncontrolled. She has never stopped fearing that everyone she loves will leave before she is ready, which is why she rushed that courthouse wedding the moment the gap threatened to open. It closed the gap, and it changed nothing inside her. Here is where it gets really dark. Season 6, Episode 5, the episode about Joyce's will. She tells Molly she is leaving the house to Victoria, and the fight that follows is sharp and painful and very Joyce, but in the middle of it, something unexpected happens. Joyce says it plainly, with no punchline attached yet. She was completely blindsided when her husband passed. She had to plan a funeral and untangle the bank accounts and figure out the bills all at once while falling apart, alone, with 2 daughters watching her. She says it like someone who has been sitting on it for 30 years, and it simply came out. 6 seasons, and this is the only moment Joyce speaks the grief out loud, the only time she says directly that this happened to her, and it broke her, and she was not ready for any of it. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross mapped 5 stages of grief, And Joyce Flynn spent 30 years stuck somewhere between denial and anger, never once reaching acceptance, because the show needed her exactly where she was. One confession. And then the show cuts to what is inside the Strongbox, which turns out to be private, intimate photographs, and the audience laughs, because the comedy format needs that release valve and needs it right now. Honestly, this is the moment that finished me off, not because of what is in the box, but because of what those photographs represent. The last private human presence her husband left behind, kept in a box inside a house she spent decades terrified of losing. She held on to both of them, the house and the photographs, for 30 years. And then the punchline landed and the laughter covered it all back over, the same way it always did. Here's the point. Was Joyce Flynn sometimes a toxic mother? Yes. An occasionally selfish partner? Fair enough. A difficult, exhausting, too much woman on a pretty consistent basis? Without question. None of those things are the complete answer, though. Joyce Flynn was a woman who lost the person who anchored her life when she was still young, who had no real framework for grief and no support system around her, and who had 2 daughters depending on her anyway, and what she built in response was a personality made entirely of noise and whine and sharpness, because quiet was where the loss lived. Swoosie Kurtz played her with such precision that you could miss it entirely, which I think is the point. She performed being fine for 30 years, and she performed it so convincingly that the show, built by Chuck Lorre and his writers to deliver laughs above everything else, never had to stop and reckon with it. And we never asked it to, because we were too busy laughing at exactly the right moments. Now when I watch Joyce fill that glass and laugh too loud and say the thing that lands just slightly too hard, the joke does not land the same way anymore. What I see instead is a woman who has been answering the same question with the same wrong answer for 30 years. The question is whether she is okay. The answer is always, watch this. If you, like me, cannot stop thinking about Joyce after all of this, you are exactly where you belong. Is Peggy Biggs the real villain of Mike and Molly, or just a woman doing the same thing Joyce did and getting half the grace? Because Katie Mixon's whole performance as Peggy starts to look very different once you have seen what this show does with women who are too much. Drop your answer below, because I read every single one.